Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and it's time for our dive into the news that we do every couple of weeks. And it's been a week where Tory leadership contender Kemi Badenoch has said she doesn't listen to podcasts where men drone on and on and on. So here today to drone on.
She knew how entertaining and wonderful this one was.
Here to drone on and on. That was Adrian Reynolds, our head of National Ministries. Hello Adrian. And John Stevens, our National Director. Hello, John.
Hi, Phil.
John, just back from Lausanne. Now, we're going to record a couple of different podcasts about Lausanne, some of the lessons there. Just give us one big headline from your time in South Korea.
Yeah, well, for those who don't know what Lausanne is, it was a gathering of Christian leaders from around the world, about 5,000 evangelical leaders, and from 200 countries. My big takeaway from it, just from meeting those guys, is wonderful encouragement at how the gospel is bearing fruit around the world in surprising places. It was just a real privilege to engage with and meet with the global church. So I would say, although we in the UK, we feel small, we feel that things are tough and difficult, we need to just remember there's a bigger picture of what God is doing in sort of remarkable work.
Praise God.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's lift our horizons. That is wonderful news and a great encouragement. There'll be a couple of podcasts coming out about that conference, so do look out for those. Adrian, the Leaders Conference is coming. We are 4 weeks away. Tickets still available. I know, yeah. More than 1,000 sold now, I think. Is that more than 1,000 coming?
More than 1,000 people coming. Still a bit of room, bit of wriggle room there. So if you want to come along, you can book until the end of the month. Really excited about it. I've started being in contact with all the people who are leading seminars and speaking. It's just been really encouraging to hear about their preparation and the work they're putting in so we can be served and so that we can grow in the gospel. But actually, not dissimilarly to Lausanne, there is a great strength in being together, reminding ourselves that as we meet on Sundays, sometimes we do feel small and we feel like we're up against it where we are. And actually just gathering together, whether that's on a global scale in Seoul at the Lausanne movement, or whether it's in Blackpool, the wonderful Blackpool, our own Seoul, I like to think. And, just celebrating actually what the Lord is doing, rejoicing with those who rejoice, sometimes mourning with those who mourn. Yeah. Just saying this is the work of the gospel. What a great thing to be able to do.
Absolutely. We're very much looking forward to it. But before that, a couple of conferences organised by Passion for Life.
Two evangelism conferences, same conference in two different places. Edinburgh next week. I'm not doing very well with dates here. It's next Friday. So where are we today? 3rd, 4th, 11th.
Yes, there we are.
Thank you. 11th, and then the following Wednesday in London, and then repeated at various different locations, like some live streams at different locations.
There's an article on our website about that, actually.
There is, and just a great way, actually, to reflect together on getting the gospel out, which is what Lausanne is really driven by, getting the gospel out. So, come and join us.
Fantastic.
I'm at both of those ones. I'd love to see you there.
Excellent. Let's talk about what's going on in the news this week. And so some sobering stories. There's no doubt about that. We've got to talk about some sobering things this week. That the conflict in the Middle East continues. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the concerns about this escalating. It absolutely has escalated this last couple of weeks. We've seen incursions from Israel into Lebanon and Beirut, fighting against Hezbollah. There's still all the conflict going on with Gaza as well. It really has moved forward, hasn't it, in a very significant way. How do we continue to pray into that? We can put the same, we've got other things available on our website that we can link to help church leaders. How do we keep praying into this and thinking about this wisely?
You go first, John, and then I'll chip in.
I think we do have to remember that God is sovereign, again, and have some confidence in that. We may not know the answers. We might not even know what is right coming out of this. I think it's important we have to hold together those two perspectives, that Israel has a right to defend itself. So they've been threatened on their northern border by Hezbollah for years, with rockets raining into northern Israel. They are taking action in order to sort of stop that and prevent that. I think actually that's justifiable, and world powers have recognised that that's justifiable. At the same time, there is that responsibility they have to observe human rights and, in a sense, not to commit war crimes, to act in an appropriate way. So I think actually it's the balance of both of those things that we have to hold in mind. I think at one level we shouldn't forget that behind much of what has been happening is actually Iran, that has been sort of funding and supporting groups that the British government recognises as terrorists, whether Hamas in kind of Gaza, Hezbollah. They're both prescribed by the British government. So here is an action against terrorist kind of organisations. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, again, have been causing immense trouble for kind of shipping through the Gulf, and again, are provided for by Iran. So that's the reason for the broader escalation here. I think the conflict may well be justified. I think the element that is often missing that gives people great concern is a long-term peace plan for the Palestinian people. Yeah. And so I would love to hear more being said about what the long-term end goal is for those at the moment who don't have a state of their own.
I think as church leaders, we need to comment on it not just in and pray, not just in geopolitical terms, which we must do. We're concerned for the world and concerned for the nation, but also in spiritual terms, which I think means a number of things. I think, first of all, it means praying for believers in these places. I mean, you'll have learnt this from Lausanne wonderfully. There are believers in all of these places, sometimes small and very persecuted, depending on which of these countries you're talking about. But there are believers in all of these places. And it's a biblical imperative to remember our brothers and sisters who are in these difficult situations. So we ought to be doing that. Let's not simply pray for the geopolitical situation and forget to pray for believers. We also, and we've got a good episode with Joseph Steinberg we can link to, we must also pray for the cause of the gospel. We want people to be saved. We want the church to be added to daily, and we want Iranians to be added, and we want people from Lebanon to be added, and people from Israel, and people from Palestine, and people from all these places to be added to the gospel. So we ought to be praying for that. And I wonder too, if we as leaders need to help our church have an eschatological view. I don't mean necessarily seeing how nations fit into God's plan. I think that's tricky, and even around the table we might have different views on that. What I mean is that the kind of the overall plan of God is clear, that one day everything is going to be made new. There will be no more wars. We are to expect these things up until the time Jesus returns. And the closing prayer of the Bible is, "Come, Lord Jesus." Yeah. And I think as leaders, we've got to be helping our people have that eternal perspective and help them to pray that prayer. So amidst all the tears and the sorrow and simply the perplexity that there is, understanding what's going on, we've got to help our people pray, "Come, Lord Jesus."
I mean, the complexity was evident at Lausanne, actually, in meeting with people.
Is that right? Yeah.
And actually, I was pointed out there are something like 26 wars around the world at the moment, some of them civil wars. And as was said, in most of those conflicts, there are Christians on both sides. Politically, which makes it complicated. In relation to the Middle East, I met quite a number of Christians who are Middle Eastern kind of Christians. They were saying, there's been a church in the Middle East for 2,000 years and has preserved a faithful witness through that time. There is no doubt that speaking to many of those who are kind of Middle Eastern Christians, they do feel that there has been a great injustice done to the Palestinian people over decades. And that obviously is a very great concern to them. That doesn't mean they justify terrorist actions, but they obviously feel that very deeply as something that is a wrong that ought to be put right. At the same time, at Lausanne, there were Jewish Christians from Israel, and those who are very supportive of Israel, who, again, are deeply offended when Israel is criticised for its actions in a way that they see as being unfair. And actually, that is just a reality that Christians are having to navigate in that region. So I think it's just a reminder to us that Christians often find themselves on both sides of these conflicts, and it's very nuanced.
And of course, next week sees the anniversary of original atrocities that Hamas perpetrated in Israel on the 7th of October. So yeah, lots to pray and think through. Something else to be thinking through very deeply, closer to home in the church, is a couple of things have happened in this last couple of weeks in relation to abuses of power, disqualifications from leadership. So we've had the report into the abuse of Mike Pilavachi at Sole Survivor, abuse of power there. KC report has been published in this last week. Also, Steve Lawson in the States, a high-profile minister, stepped down from his ministry owing to an inappropriate relationship with a woman who was not his wife. He's been disqualified. These things are difficult and sobering and very close to home for us as evangelical Christians.
They are, and they seem to keep coming, don't they? Just when we think, I think to myself, perhaps naively, I hope that's it now. But of course, it never is, because that's the nature of the human heart.
Nature of sin. Yeah.
And just before we get into these ones in detail, I think we do need to reflect on these two particular cases. One, because it's a UK high-profile leader in the UK, and another because there will be lots of people in our churches, in FIEC churches, who will have benefited deeply from the ministry of Ligonier, where Steve Lawson was. But just before we get into that, I do think we need to set it in a wider context. With, we need to be reflecting that it's not just sexual abuse or power abuse. There is financial abuse that goes on, and there is actually the overall abuse just of bad leaders leading people astray. Which is in a sense a kind of ultimate abuse, isn't it? That when people are teaching a false gospel, when people are teaching that you can be saved this way, where the scriptures are clear that you can't, we need to grieve over that as well. So I think my temptation is to feel each of these particular cases very, very deeply, especially when you've either met the people or you know some of the people involved, to feel them very, very deeply and to become quite despondent about them. But I think there's a sense in which we've got to grieve rightly over bad shepherding in every sense. And these are grievous examples of poor bad shepherding, let's call it that, bad shepherding. But there are plenty others as well. So we must feel strongly about the church down the road where the gospel is not being proclaimed and there is a leader there. He is leading them astray, or she is leading them astray. And we've got to feel, I think, as strongly about those things as we do about these grievous cases. So it's not diminishing these, it's elevating everything to say, the scriptures are very clear about poor shepherds, about bad shepherds. So praise God that we have a good shepherd, and let's heed the call to be good shepherds ourselves, which actually is what our conference is about.
I think that's right. I think the Bible tells us that these things will happen within the church. So I think when we hear of them, they're deeply grievous, particularly for people who have looked to particular leaders as a model, who may have been very significant and influential in their conversion and in their ministry. That is obviously devastating. It creates a lack of trust, causes people to question maybe themselves, their ministry. But the Bible does warn us that this will happen within the life of the church, because sin gets into the church. There are sort of wolves in sheep's clothing. I also think we shouldn't forget that the vast majority of pastors and church leaders are faithfully labouring away, and they're not sinning in these sort of ways. So that one of the features of, I think, the modern world with the news, social media, is that intense scrutiny is able to be focused on sort of high-profile fools in this way, and they kind of, in a sense, dominate in the news in a way that perhaps might not have been the case in the past. So that's not to decry their significance at all, but it is. We mustn't fall into a cynicism about the church as a whole that loses sight of the fact that the vast majority of local church leaders are getting on faithfully, ministering the gospel in self-sacrificial
and the default position
ways.
For a church member is to have confidence in their leaders. That's that's a scriptural injunction.
I did see an interesting post on social media where somebody had said, in other news, thousands of pastors going about their business, faithfully serving the Lord across the world. And that's true as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it's worth recognising, actually, these two that we're talking about, they demonstrate that these are problems in all constituencies. It's not one particular constituency, it's every constituency has been affected. Again, in Korea, one of things happened. The Korean church leaders were speaking about challenges in their church. Moral failures within the church have been a significant issue that they are greatly concerned about within the church in Korea. So it's not just sort of here. It's not just in one particular group. This is an ongoing issue that the church has always had to deal with.
I've not read the Mike Pilavachi report, John. You have. Are there lessons in there for us?
I think a lot of lessons, actually. So the report into Mike Pilavachi, it's not an investigation into discovering the truth of what happened. Right, so this is more of a review of why it happened and why nothing was done. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's a very balanced and detailed review. I think it reminds us of the sort of real issue of abuse of power within spiritual leadership. The key thing here was that Mike developed very intense personal relationships, often with young men in the kind of 18 to 24 bracket. And whether he realised it or not, the report makes clear in that situation, you have an immense amount of power over people's lives. It had various common features with...
So misuse of power is not necessarily just something that's intentional on your part. It could be almost subconscious.
It can be, and I think the investigators in this report say they're not actually able to make judgments on that. At one level, he might have been in some measures naive. Whether that was the case or not, they don't make a judgment on that. But they recognise that, or what they're saying is that all leaders and all churches ought to recognise that potential for the misuse of power. And it has those common characteristics of here's an older man who basically is taking younger people under his wing. They become favourites. They develop a very intense relationship with him. He often recruits them in personally, offers them the possibility of ministry opportunities. And then along the way, people get dropped without explanation. So they've been very closely brought in and then they're suddenly kind of ditched and ostracised.
Ghosted is the word that was used, wasn't it? They just stopped contacting them. Yeah.
Which, again, the investigators say has caused significant psychological harm to those individuals. With some of them, Mike engaged in kind of wrestling and fighting. That was sometimes public, but also in private in his house. He had a sort of an obsession with massage, which was a key part of his behaviour. And again, people would come back to his house and some of these young men were massaged, sometimes only just in their kind of underwear. That's the kind of the context of what has happened. So I think that the report is really picking up on the question of why wasn't anything done about this? Why wasn't there a recognition of this danger? And I think there you've got a combination of things going on. So for some people, they're encountering with Mike and what he's doing. They only see a tiny part of the picture, not the whole as it's put together as a result of an investigation. But those who are in positions of leadership, those who should have been exercising accountability, trustees of the kind of the church, Soul Survivor, and the festival. The report says actually the natures of the behaviour here ought to have, at the very least, raised questions about inappropriate kind of behaviour that should have been tackled and that should have been addressed. There are some instances in which senior people had specific allegations that were brought to them that they didn't adequately and appropriately deal with. But I think there is this spectrum, people to whom very specific allegations were brought but didn't deal with them. There's the more general role of trustees who should have perhaps interpreted this pattern of behaviour as kind of creating questions and a failure to put in place proper safeguarding procedures that might have protected people. And then you've got sort of individuals who may have seen a snippet of what was happening, but not the whole picture.
Can I ask, is there an issue here of this ministry cannot fail?
Well, I mean, in terms of...
Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. What they pick up on the report is that here is a celebrity who has obviously had great success. He has grown a church from a tiny number to thousands, has the biggest youth festival in the UK with 35,000 or so people attending it. Again, yes, allowances are made for that celebrity and that success. They make the point at some point that some things were overlooked because of the potential impact on the wider movement. So I think they highlight the particular difficulty of celebrity leaders and anointed leaders. But again, I think it's worth recognising that that's not just the case within charismatic circles. So he was a sort of charismatic, both personally and also theologically, but actually Reformed conservative groups have their own celebrity individuals who are put up on platforms and who are sort of, in a sense, their ministries are seen as being too important to fail or to suffer.
The Stephen Lawson case is not quite that, is it? I mean, he was in conservative circles, I think he was a celebrity. You know, he had a very significant position, not only in a local church, but in a wider movement, which is perhaps a different question again. And what happened appeared to be private is that it has been discovered. It's come to light, which is obviously a good thing that these things have been brought out into the open. But it wasn't something, I don't think it appears, that people knew about and just said nothing about. It was something that he managed to keep private. And it's just a reminder as well that some sin is out in the open and needs to be dealt with when we hear about it. But we also need to recognise that some people are sinning and doing a pretty good job of covering it up. In all kinds of different ways. And I think our technological connected world does allow people to get away with that. I mean, the relationship that Stephen Lawson apparently had, it appears to be consummated, but some kind of inappropriate relationship with a younger woman appears to have happened over a distance. She didn't live near where he lived, but obviously I think it's probably still an exercise of power that came through his position. That's what it seems to be. But it is a reminder that actually secret things will be brought to light. And I think we need to guard our own hearts as leaders, not simply about being seen to do the right thing, but actually just constantly reflecting and asking God to reveal the inner desires and motives of our own hearts. And we mustn't think that because something is hidden from view, that somehow it doesn't matter. So, the person who's addicted to pornography, for example, that somehow it's hidden from view and so it doesn't matter. And these things do matter, and our integrity before the Lord actually is at stake here.
Can I ask a question about if folk listening looked up to either these two men or others who have been disqualified from ministry? How do you deal with that when it's somebody who meant a lot to you? You might not even have known them personally, but their ministry is one you've imbibed and meant a lot to you. How
yes,
do we relate
I guess
to
the
that?
question is, can you just airbrush them out of history? I mean, it's interesting. This is analogous, I think, what's happened with Hugh Edwards, another very seedy story, obviously not particularly a Christian story, although he had Christian connections. And what's happened with him, and the BBC have basically tried to airbrush him out of almost everything he ever presented, which is difficult because he announced the Queen's... Did he announce the Queen's death or the Prince Duke of Edinburgh's death? Anyway, it's quite difficult to do. So that becomes a question, what do you do with people who have blessed you in their ministry? Lots of people would have said when they were in Cambridge, they were, years ago, they were blessed by Roy Clement's ministry. What do you do with books written by these people? I've got books on my shelves which have been pulped by publishers now because of something that's happened. So I think we do need to think that actually people, God uses others to bless us, and sometimes broken and sometimes always sinful people to bless us. That doesn't diminish the blessing that we've received, because actually it comes from God ultimately. But I think we do need to be constantly questioning who our heroes are, and that we need to hold lightly to that. So we need to be very grateful. I think one of the disciplines of the Christian life is when we're blessed by something is I want to say something to you, for you've blessed me by a sermon. I want to say something to you, but I want to acknowledge actually it's God who's blessed me through you. And that I think allows me to get beyond that hanging on to you particularly as my hero.
It's not putting your trust in princes, I guess.
I think that's right. I think it's important that we differentiate. There are some people who are going to have been very close to these leaders,
for whom it will be extremely
whom they
difficult.
personally ministered to, for whom the sense of betrayal is going to be very great. Actually, for many of the people, they're not that. They're those who've observed the ministry at a distance, and actually they feel a connection with the person that's not a real connection because they've just heard them as a speaker or they've listened to them online.
It's been mediated
and
to them.
They do feel betrayed by it, but I think we must recognise that ought to be different to the person who's been very deeply personally involved. This is the point at which actually we need to remember we don't believe in a mediatorial priesthood. That in the end, actually, Jesus ministers to us through his word, by his spirit, through other people. Actually, we don't have human intermediaries. And actually, sometimes the desire to have a human intermediary to create that celebrity person is actually a failure to remember that is the case. And I think for those who are at a distance, we more easily are able to say, actually, remember that it's Jesus who's your priest.
Absolutely.
This individual has failed, but Jesus hasn't.
And he will never fail you.
But I want to say that's very different from helping the person who has been very personally hurt by them. A couple of lessons that I think are good that come out of the report that are really helpful. And again, every church and organisation ought to take into account. And I think everything that's happened over the past 5 to 10 years is meaning people are learning things that maybe they didn't appreciate quite as clearly in the past. The culture is changing, and that's a good thing. But there are key things to learn. So the report highlights the vital importance of taking into account the possibility of sort of homosexual sort of temptations and sin. Again, evangelicals have tended to be very hot on opposite sex risks. It makes the point, sort of Mike Pilavachi made a lot about, I won't be with a woman alone or whatever, but actually people then weren't thinking about the possibility that actually there is something that may be going on in relation to young men. And I think some of our whole constructs about purity and temptation, what you ought to do, they just actually have a solely heterosexual perspective to them. And I think the report is saying, actually, we cannot be as naive as that. I actually think it's helpful that in the sort of recent past, evangelicals who struggle with same-sex attraction have been more honest about that. I think in the past there was a lot of suppression within the Christian community, and I think there is a danger of moving back to a kind of suppression, and that's not healthy, and it makes it more difficult. So that's one thing to recognise. I think a second thing the report made clear, which I think is really helpful, was that the trustees were basically all mates and friends of Mike. And basically you end up with a group of trustees who are all essentially supporters, and they remain trustees for a long period of time. And the consequence of that is they are unable to exercise the degree of scrutiny and objectivity that is required in that situation. So one of the report's recommendations is making sure that your trust body has that ability to operate a more independent, objective scrutiny. Now, I think that's really important for church elderships and the leadership of local churches. If we think the elders have got to be a group of people who are all utterly agreed with each other and they're all basically mates who are friends supporting one another, you can easily lose sight of that element of scrutiny. We do need to be in contexts in which a proper accountability can be exercised. Another element associated with that was who can people go to safely report? If you've got a powerful person, they're on the trust board, they may be even chairing the trust board, as was the case here. It's very difficult for people to raise that. Providing channels for people to be able to raise their concerns safely, because lots of people felt they couldn't speak into the situation. Yep. And then I think a final area is that there was a pretty irregular ordination of Mike by the Church of England. So for a long period he was a lay leader, but then because the church was growing and successful, the bishop ordained him and he became the leader within the Church of England. The point is made that it didn't go through the regular procedures. There wasn't the same element of scrutiny of his calling and his behaviour. There wasn't the same element of training ahead of ordination. And the point is made, if those proper procedures had been followed, then maybe some of these patterns of behaviour would have been picked up on and been corrected, or maybe people would have sort of, in a sense, questioned whether or not it was right to be ordained in that regard. And so, in a sense, wanting to validate a ministry that appeared to be successful without actually going through the proper process of scrutiny and training. Again, that is sort of criticised in the report. And I think those are just basic lessons that every church and every Christian organisation can take on board.
Thank you, John. Sobering stuff. Brothers, we've spent longer on that than I'd anticipated, but it's an important subject for us to touch on. So we were going to talk about the Tory leadership, but I think we'll skip that.
That will still be going.
Yeah,
Phil.
In a fortnight's time.
Next time we
takes
meet.
Forever. But let's touch on one final thing. It's quite. I've put in my notes here. Ian Hislop. This is the Private Eye editor and presents of our. He's on. Have I Got News for You as one of the hosts, isn't he?
Was he shot at?
Was he shot at? No. That's what I've written in my notes.
Story.
That's our story. Ian Hislop. Was he shot at? No.
I like this non-story. So it goes something like this. Ian Hislop was in a black cab in central London near the Private Eye offices.
Window shatters.
And the Guardian and the Times both reported he was shot at. The cab driver called the police. The whole area was shut down. The armed response vehicles came in, and it became headline news. You know, here's someone who makes a living out of poking fun, sometimes helpfully, at others, and doing investigative journalism.
I like the fact it was called an assassination attempt at one point, as if he was like a world leader.
Yes, there we are. And then Ian Hislop apparently spent 24 hours being really, quite scared, actually. This is an escalation of where we've got to before. Anyway, it turns out when the police looked at the CCTV, it was a car backfiring and something just snapping against the cab window. It turned out to be
fault.
nothing.
Yeah.
But as I was reflecting on that, it did make me chuckle. And I have no doubt that within the private eye offices and in the episode that this evening, I guess, that will be recorded, the BBC programme, If I Got News For You, there will be a lot of joking going on, a lot of poking fun. Perhaps some people will feel that Ian Hislop's got his comeuppance. But it just made me realise how quick we can be and how easy it is to catastrophise things, to make them and expect them and anticipate them to be the worst possible outcome on any spectrum. And I think those of us who are Brits, many of our church leaders are, there is something about the British psyche that likes to do this. It's the headlines in the tabloids, or even in any paper actually, that kind of basically expects the worst. That we're all going to hell in a handcart, that everything is bad. The general news agenda is to look at bad stories, not good stories. Yep. And I think as church leaders, we've got to help our churches not catastrophize everything. So, for example, a gifted individual in the church leaves because they've moved somewhere else. It's a disaster. Church is going to fall apart. Nothing's going to get done. And we're not serving our churches with that kind of attitude. I think we've got to be more positive. We want to be realists. I'm not saying we should stick our head in the sand. We want to be realists. But I think as a Christian who is indwelt by the Spirit, and the Spirit is at work in his church, and Jesus gives good gifts to his church, and he's sovereign and head over the church, I think on the whole, I want to be an optimist. So I've got to fight against that negativity all the time. And I think that's really important for us as church leaders. I think history has told us that things generally don't turn out as bad as we think they might. So there we go. Ian Hislop, I'm glad he's alive, and just jolly well be a bit more positive about life.
John?
Well, I think it's a lesson, isn't it? It's a reminder that wait for the proper investigation.
Yeah.
As with so these things. So something has happened. Actually, I guess the reason why that story flies is it is plausible. Ian Hislop has probably alienated some very significant and powerful people in the investigations that he's conducted. But actually to report it as that is what happened before that's been confirmed by the investigation. So I think there is a lesson there that actually things happen, leaping to conclusions as to what and why. There is a proper process of investigation that needs to be required. And actually, I think that again is a problem for Christians. We want to make our judgment, and that's often influenced by what we think might have happened, is plausible, or even sometimes it's wish fulfillment that we think it's happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually,
I've got to tell you a story, sorry to finish. I know it's going to take a minute, but we're out of time. But you've got to hear the story, Phil, because it is a classy story.
I want to hear it, Adrian.
So I was working in London for another Christian organisation on Borough High Street, very busy thoroughfare, really at quite a sort of security height in terms of risks and things. And we'd been told by the local police, if we saw anything suspicious, we could contact them straight away. And suspicious packages, so on and so forth. So I was looking out of my office window one day and I saw a box by the curbside, just a cardboard box, where there shouldn't have been a cardboard box. So I thought, what do I do with this? Just a cardboard box, surely. And one of my colleagues said, I think we should call the police. Well, what's the worst that could happen? So we called the police and explained what had happened. And literally within 2 minutes, the bomb squad arrived. Wow. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary. And out of the back of the bomb squad van came a uniformed police officer. And not with all the bomb squad kit on, just a uniformed police officer in his regular gear, walked up to the cardboard box and gave it an almighty kick. And the box went flying, and he went and picked the box up and put it in the bin. And then he came and knocked on the door to tell me that the problem had been sorted. And I said, seems to me to be quite a high-risk strategy. To which his answer was, well, if it was a bomb, it probably would have gone off before anyway. That's brilliant. That's quite a cavalier attitude, but I was just pleased, and I had seen it, and I think because of all the messages I've been receiving, I was expecting the worst, but the policeman came and just gave it a big tonk, and it was fine.
Fantastic, Adrian. I'm delighted that that's a story you've told that I've never heard before.
Are you saying that I've told you? Oh,
some stories, Adrian, I've heard more than once, but that one I've never heard, which I'm grateful for. Brothers, time has beaten us. Thank you for helping us to think through some really sobering things, as well as some more light-hearted things in our regular dive into the news. If you've enjoyed the podcast, do rate, leave a review so others can find it. And we look forward to speaking to you.
Thanks, Phil.
Again soon. God bless.
Thanks, Phil.